Hi everyone, for this video I'm going to be talking about the second major project for WRIT 1120, which is the Research Proposal and Bibliography project. The Research Proposal and Bibliography project involves you developing the topic that you started in your incident analysis into something that's researchable. So to do that, in this proposal project, you're going to be constructing a research question to explore ultimately in your researched project. So you need to develop a question, propose the kind of research that you want to do, and then also develop an annotated bibliography of sources that you plan to use in that researched project. And we'll walk through each of those components of the project in this video. There's also a lot more detailed information about what these pieces look like on the assignment sheet. The first thing that you're going to need to do for this project is design a research study that you're ultimately going to conduct to answer that research question. You should be grounding your research proposal in readings of relevant scholarship, and those will include at least 8 sources that help situate your project. It's going to help give your project context. It's going to look at information that already exists on your topic and help you arrive at a conclusion about your topic. So keep in mind that going into this project and into your research, you shouldn't already have an answer in mind. Instead, you should develop a research question that you're genuinely curious about and that you want to find out more. The second piece of this project, after your proposal, is including the annotated bibliography. So in that bibliography, you'll include a full citation for each one of your sources, as well as an annotation that includes a summary of the source, commentary on its content, and a description of its usefulness for this project. And I'll talk through a little bit more about what those annotations look like later in the video. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the process of planning your research. And it's important to actually develop a plan for that research before you start. And this might be a little bit new to you, a little bit different than maybe how you've handled research projects in the past, and that's okay. This project is all about giving you the skills to really design a study and go in with an open mind. So when you're encountering resources, when you're encountering research, how to have an open mind and not go in with a predetermined set of answers. Instead, we're going to be designing the actual research process and talking through how to use that research to develop conclusions. So just to recap, in case you need a refresher on how these major projects fit together, remember that your incident analysis was a narrative of your personal experience with an issue, and maybe an exploration of the possible areas for research. Now keep in mind that you're going to build on that discussion, build on what you already know, and build on what you were thinking about as possible avenues for research in this research proposal and annotated bib. This project is about proposing a specific question that you want to explore further, and it needs to be about that issue that you talked about in your incident analysis. Keep in mind that there's a little flexibility here, so maybe you're going down a slightly different avenue, or maybe you're narrowing or widening what it is that you're looking at, but it still should be directly related to what you wrote about in your incident analysis. Keep in mind too that you're entering this project without having specific answers in mind. You shouldn't already think you know the response to your research question as you get started with this research process. You should be going in wanting to learn more and with an explorer's mind. After we do this proposal, that's going to lead to your researched project, where you're going to be responding to the research question you pose here about that issue and using the scholarly sources from your annotated bibliography as well as that personal knowledge to support some kind of argument. So how do we go about doing this project? The first thing to do is to consider possibilities for your research, and you might have started to do this in your incident analysis, which is a great place to start. Next, you need to develop a specific research question, and there'll be another video available to you on developing that research question. Then, after you have a solid question in mind, use library databases to develop some keywords and search for relevant sources to include in your bibliography that are going to help you respond to that research question. Keep in mind that if this research question hasn't already been directly responded to, you might have to find some sources that help you think through that question, but that aren't necessarily giving you specific answers. Looking for sources that are related, but maybe don't directly respond to your question is a good move here. Now that can be kind of difficult, especially if this is your first major research project. The first part of this project is a research proposal. Now this proposal is essentially to design the research that you want to do. The second piece of this project is the annotated bibliography. That's the part where you list your sources and summarize them. I'm going to talk through each of these two major parts and what they look like in this video. As we move through that discussion, remember that this project needs to include at least 8 scholarly sources. It needs to be at least 5 pages long, and the proposal piece of your project should probably be about 2 pages. The rest of your project length will come from that annotated bibliography. It's okay if you feel like your proposal needs to be a little longer, and it's okay if it ends up a little short of 2 pages, but the 2 pages range is a nice solid guide for about how long you should be discussing this research project's design. In the proposal piece of your project, remember that's the first part, you need to do a couple of things. First, you need to identify your research question and the reasoning for your interest. So this is the section of your project where I find you can pull a little bit from your incident analysis. Describe what's motivating your research. Why do you want to investigate into this topic more? Also, you're going to want to showcase your current views, any assumptions you have, biases, or personal perspectives as they relate to the topic. So if you're writing about something that is personally relevant to you, you might have biases. It's impossible to approach anything without preconceived notions or biases. Instead of trying to erase those from your identity and your writing, acknowledge them. Rather than trying to negate those feelings or approach it neutrally, instead, identify what baggage, what background, what information are you coming to your research question with, and what is that going to have to look like as you're incorporating it into your project. Next, you're going to want to describe what you hope your research is going to accomplish, whether that's to encourage some kind of change, to provide education, or to suggest further study. And if you're hoping it's going to accomplish something, that means that you're approaching this topic with a specific audience in mind. Identify that audience for us and let us know who it is you're trying to reach. You might look back to your incident analysis to look for who the stakeholders are in this topic. Are you looking to reach the people who it impacts? Are you looking to reach the people who can provide some kind of change? Maybe it's a little of both. Identify that audience here and what it is you hope that they ultimately think or do or believe after they've read through your research project. The second piece of this project is the annotated bibliography. This is typically the part of the project that I find most folks struggle with. And that's just because it's a very strange genre for a lot of people, and it seems like it has a lot of rules. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of times when you're doing an annotated bibliography, there are specific rules or guidelines that different instructors are going to provide to you, and when you're doing your own independent research, you can have different reasons for doing a bibliography. For our purposes, I've given you some guidelines for writing the source entry that I think will be helpful to you as you move forward with your research project. So the whole reasoning behind doing a bibliography is to really have a central location for your notes for this project, and also to have a research guide for anyone else who might want to do research on this topic in the future. So bibliographies are typically used by the person who wrote them, and then also future researchers who might want to investigate this topic further. Keep that in mind as you're writing the bibliography. You want to be as transparent as possible and provide as much information about the source itself that if you're reading it later on, or if future researchers are reading it, they know what this information is all about. Bibliography itself should include a source entry for all of your scholarly sources that you're using in this project. Each source entry has 2 components. First, it should have an APA citation of the source. This needs to be a full citation, and typically in APA, if you're doing a journal article or a book, that'll include information like authors, title, location of publication, and if it's a journal article, it'll likely include a volume number, an issue number, and a date of publication. If you're using electronic sources, make sure to include a link so that your readers and you later on can easily access the source. There are great guides for doing APA formatting on our Canvas site and also on Purdue OWL. I encourage you, if you're using the library databases, to check out the Cite This button where it gives you the APA citation, but keep in mind that those aren't perfect. So it's a really good starting point, but you're likely going to have to go back in and edit the capitalization, anything that needs to be italicized, and so forth. So it might have the information there, but it might not be formatted quite correctly. It's an okay place to start, but make sure you go back and edit. The second piece to each source entry is the annotation, and this might be the part that's a little unfamiliar to you. The annotation is really a fancy word for a summary of this source. It needs to be about 100 to 250 words, so really no more than a paragraph. And if you want to think about each of these requirements as an individual sentence, that's a perfect way to go about it. I find it to be true that once you do 1 or 2 citations and annotations, you fall into a rhythm and it becomes kind of formulaic. That's okay for this project. You don't need to feel like you need to reinvent each of your sentences or have any kind of variety in your sentence structure. Instead, focus on getting the information out there as clearly and concisely as possible. So it's okay if you think about this kind of like an equation. You're going to plug in information to each of these sections of the entry, and they might look pretty similar from source to source. For each annotation, you want to include a couple of things. First, the thesis or goal or motivation for the source. So what is it that they're ultimately trying to do in this source? Then, make sure you mention their methods for research. This can be things like conducting surveys, doing experiments, interviews. What is it that they did to gather their data and information? Then, what are their results? What conclusions did they draw after doing their research? This is important because it's probably what you're going to ultimately use in your research project. Then, analyze the source a little bit. Think about what the gaps and weaknesses are of the source, as well as the strengths and uniqueness. So, are there any things that give you pause about the article or the book? Are there things that they seem to have not mentioned, or things that seem to be missing from their analysis? Are there things that are unique about the source that you aren't seeing in other research you found? Are there strengths, things that you think really make this source incredibly useful? And finally, what's the relationship of this source to your research? Why choose it and why use it in your research project? So think about those first 3 pieces as kind of a summary, and the second 3 pieces as an analysis. After you've completed that small paragraph, you're going to have a really strong background on the source itself, a good place to look for your notes, and to help you remember what each source is about. As I've mentioned a couple times in this video, you need to be using scholarly sources for this project. It's important to mention that that means you aren't using popular sources or trade sources, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. Scholarly sources are those that are written by people who are authorities on a subject. Typically, it's people like professors or other researchers. They also need to be sources that are written for other authorities or scholars in the field. So typically the audience for a scholarly research article is other people who are also scholarly researchers. Typically, people who are writing these sources expect their readers to understand the jargon or the special language that they're using, and the tone of the writing is often more formal. Typically, in a scholarly source, there are other scholarly sources that are cited, and those are typically cited in a formal style using endnotes, footnotes, bibliographies, references pages, or works cited pages, depending on what kind of formatting system they're using. So when you're looking at a scholarly source, you should also be looking to make sure that they're providing attribution and sourcing. It also should be noted that if they are including that information, that's a great jumping off point for you to do your own research. If you found a source that you think is really useful and they're citing a certain source over and over again, go look up that source. Use their bibliography or their references page as a guide for your research too, just as maybe your annotated bibliography could provide a jumping off point for future researchers. Typically, when you look at a scholarly source, it has a couple of components. Those sources typically are labeled in different sections. They might have headings or headers. Often they have an abstract, a conclusion, bibliography, and so forth. If there are images, they're often charts, tables, or graphs, but sometimes they might be figures or photographs. If they're using images or charts, typically they're labeled and described in the source. The main reason we use scholarly sources rather than popular or trade sources is the experience that they go through in order to be published. Scholarly sources go through what's called peer review, and it's a little bit different than when you do peer review in your writing class. The peer review process for a scholarly source is when the writer or writers submit their article to be published to a specific journal, and other experts in the field who are editors of that journal read through it anonymously and check for accuracy, check to make sure that their methods are sound, and that their research holds up as scholarly and well articulated. So typically, you have 3 to 4 other experts in the field reading through a source and giving it the okay to be published. This means that not only did a scholar or researcher have to go through the process of researching and writing the article, but other scholar researchers had to also go through it and make sure that it is a useful source. Whereas a popular or trade source might just have one editor or a section editor at a magazine or newspaper. A scholarly source has other experts on the content looking at that source and making sure that it holds up to the standards of scholarship and research. That's why, for our purposes, we need to use scholarly sources. Keep in mind that you can also use primary sources, and you can look for more information on how to go about designing primary sources in our Canvas site. A couple of notes and tips as you go about your research process. Keep in mind that all of those sources that you're using should be scholarly and found using the library databases or other scholarly databases. Don't just Google your topic or use newspapers, magazines, blogs, or other websites as sources. You need to be using library databases provided to you through the university. A good tip as you're wading through all of this research, and there will be a lot, is to annotate as you read. Keep in mind that it's easier to review your notes than to reread an entire source. So a lot of your journal articles might be upwards of 20 or 30 pages. Once you've read that once, you probably don't want to go through the process of reading it again. Instead, use highlighting, note-taking, use a separate notebook or Word document, wherever it is that you think you can best use your notes. Keep that available. Reading through those notes will take you a lot less time and probably will refresh your memory about what that source is actually about a lot better than reading through those 30 pages again. Remember that you can include primary research for this project. Still include an entry in your bibliography for each interview or observation you conduct. If you're doing surveys, only include one entry for that survey rather than an entry for each survey response. That would get very lengthy. This project involves a whole lot of reading. It's possibly more reading than you've ever had to do for a writing project before. So keep in mind that you want to pace yourself and break the project up into tasks that are going to help you with project management. Look at how long we have to complete the project, and then try to divide up different tasks into specific days or time frames. So maybe you want to read one source per day, or you want to write out one source entry per day. Just make sure that you have a plan on how to tackle the project. Some other great resources are available on conducting research like this. I strongly encourage you to look to Purdue OWL and the Jerome Library for sources on conducting scholarly research. And these links will all be included on our resources page in Canvas. Things like the difference between scholarly and trade or popular resources, as well as how to get specific with your research, are great places to go. Also keep in mind that the Jerome Library has individual research appointments you can make with a librarian. These are great resources to use. You sit down one-on-one with a librarian and they help you find sources for your project. Lots of students have had great experiences with those individual research appointments and have often found all of their sources while sitting down with a librarian. You can also chat with a librarian through the Jerome Library webpage. So if you're struggling or you have a specific question about database research, you could use the chat to help you. There are a lot of resources available to you to help you out with this project. Look for those resources in our Canvas site, and remember to check out the assignment sheet for some more specifics on what this project looks like.